Hello there, everyone. Hello. I just kicked off my shoes, started relaxing. I just realized I didn't make a YouTube video yesterday. And so we're going to continue our readathon of Wealth, Poverty, and Politics by Dr. Thomas Sowell. Dr. Thomas Sowell, this beautiful soul, decided to write this book, Wealth, Poverty, and Politics. So I am going to read it now. We're going to read chapter 1. We already read the prefix chapter. So we're going to read the issues. That's what it's called. Chapter 1, Issues. The wealth of nations depends on an infinite variety of causes. Alexander Hamilton. That's a quote by Alexander Hamilton. Beautiful quote. I don't know. It may be understandable and commendable that people are living in the most prosperous nations today are often shocked by how far lower standards of living in third world countries, or by how less fortunate people in their own society live. But if our own purpose is to understand the causes of such things, we cannot proceed as if we happen to be used around us is something that can be assured to happen so naturally or automatically that the issue can be posed to another why nations fail when they do not have the same high standards of living as suggested by the title of the well-known contemporary study. A substitute or well-known contemporary study that includes the origins of inequality, as if economic equality is so natural, automatic, or common that is absolute, is what needs to be explaining. Despite how widespread the implicit assessments may be in much that could be said today, it is questionable whether such assumptions can survive in the modest summary of history. Even in a country long recognized as one of the most prosperous on earth, the United States of America, at the beginning of the 20th century, only 10. And so the Why Nations Fail, The Origins of Power is the book. These are just the sources he's listed on the bottom of the page. I'm sorry, I was just reading the bottom page sources. 10% of American homes had flush toilets. Only 3% had electric lights. So this was at the beginning of the 20th century he's talking about. There's nothing automatic about prosperity. The standards of living we have taken for granted for today have been achieved only within a very minute fraction of history of the human race, and by no means the norm among people in the world today. Standards of living are far beyond what we could consider to be poverty, and the norm for untold thousands of years. It is not the origins of poverty that need to be explained, since the human species began in poverty. What requires explaining are things that are created and sustained with higher standards of living. Equality of economic outcomes has been rather rare than prosperity. How does this explain the origins of something like inequality, which has an unambiguous as far back as recorded history goes? The ancient Greeks had geography, philosophy, agriculture, literature at a time when Britain was a land of illiterate travel people living at primitive level. Athens had Opolis, whose ruins are still impressive today, thousands of years later. At the time when there was not even a single building in all of Britain, the ancient Greeks had Plato, Aristotle, and other landmark figures who helped lay intellectual foundations of Western civilization. At the time when there were not a single Briton whose name had entered the pages of histories, scholars had estimated there were parts of Europe in ancient times that were living at the level of Greece that had transcended thousands of years earlier. There had been other complex civilizations in the ancient world. In Egypt, India, China, for example, at a time when peoples in various parts of Europe and elsewhere were just beginning to learn the rubrics rudiments of agriculture. Vast disparities in wealth and wealth creating capacity have been common for millennium, but a large economic inequalities have been persisted throughout recorded history of the human race, and the particular pattern of those inequalities have changed drastically over the centuries. While the Greeks while the Greeks were far more advanced than the Britons in ancient times, Britons are far more advanced than the Greeks in the 19th century. Britain had led the world into the industrial age. Britain alone produced more than 40% of the major inventions and discoveries and innovations in the world. From the mid 18th century to the first quarter of the 19th century, its technological premise was matched by the premise as a conquering nation. The 20th century Italian scholar asked, how in the first place did a Pearl Island arise from a primitive scholar to world domination? At its peak, the British Empire included 1/4 of the world's land area and 1/4 of all the people on Earth. Such historical changes in the roles of particular peoples and nations have occurred in other places and times. The Chinese were, for centuries, more advanced than any Europeans, including among their discoveries and inventions, the compass, printing, paper, rudders, and porcelain plates that the West called Chinaware, or simply China. The cast iron produced in China for 1,000 years before it was produced in Europe. China a Chinese admiral made the voyage. Oh my God. Discovery longer than Columbus's voyage, generations before Columbus's voyage, and the ships were larger and more advanced than Columbus's ships, but in relative positions of China and Europe also reversed over the centuries. Various other peoples living in various other parts of the world had their own eras of leadership, in leadership in particular fields, or advance across many specialties. Agriculture was the most life-changing advance in the evolution of human societies. Came to Europe from the Middle East in ancient times. Agriculture made cities possible, while human hunter-gatherers required too much land to provide for themselves with food for them to settle permanently in compact and densely populated communities. Moreover, for centuries, cities around the world have been produced a wholly disappointing share of all the advances in arts, sciences, and technology compared to the achievements of similar numbers of people scattered throughout the hilllands. Because Greeks were located near the Middle East than the peoples of Northern Europe or Western Europe, agriculture spread to the Greeks much earlier, and they could be urbanized much earlier by centuries, and the advanced ways far beyond those people elsewhere who had not yet received the benefits made by people in urban living. The ancient geographic location could not create a genius. It made it possible for settling in as many people as could develop in their own mental potential far beyond what was possible among bands of hunter-gatherers roaming the vast territory, preoccupied with pressing a need for search for food. Sorry, I'm terrible at reading. My God. This book is way harder than I thought it would be. Geography has not predetermined what people choose to do, but it can limit or expand the number of what kinds of options were available. Geography is one of the influences of vast economic differences. Geography is just one of the influence behind a vast economic differences among people and places. Moreover, these differences are not simply differences in standards of living. More important More important as such differences are, different geographic settings to also expand or restrict development of people's own mental potential into the economists we call the human capital by presenting different peoples across a wider or narrow cultural universe. These geographic settings not differ only horizontally between Europe, Asia, and Africa, for example, but also vertically between peoples living in plains versus people living in the mountains. One geographic study puts it, the mountain regions have discouraged the building of a genius because they are in areas of isolation, confined, remote from the current men and ideals that move along the river valleys. Many mountain regions across the world, whether it's the Appalachian Mountains in the United States, the Rift Mountains of Morocco, the Pyrenees Mountains of Greece, or the Himalaya Mountains in Asia, or other mountains elsewhere, show the patterns of poverty and backwardness, as distinguished between the French historian Hedrick Berlick puts it. Mountain life persisted, lagged behind the plain. This especially was during the millennium before transportation and communications revolutionized the past 2 centuries, which broadly brought more progress of the outside world to isolated mountain villages. What these technological revolutions could not bring to the mountains, however, were the previous centuries of cultural development, and other people had in more favorable environments. People living in the mountains could try to catch up, of course. The rest of the world would not be standing still while they were doing so. Mountains were just one geographic feature, and geography is just one influence on human development. But whether you're considering geography or culture, isolation is a recurring factor in poverty and backwardness around the world. Whether it is a physical isolationist or a cultural isolationist, cultural isolation, oh my god, physical isolation or cultural isolation, and any number of particular reasons that will be explored in chapters ahead. Oh my god, I'm so bad at reading today, guys. I'm sorry. I'm putting freaking endings of words that shouldn't be there because my brain just constantly can't think. Okay, we're gonna continue reading. This is a garbage show. My god. Whether the reasons of economic disparities among peoples and nations are such disparities have been common in modern times, such as in ancient times. In the 21st century, Switzerland, Denmark, and Germany had 3 times more capita gross domestic product than of Albania, Serbia, or Ukraine, and Norway had more than 5 times per capita of these Eastern European countries. Such economic disparities are not particular in Europe. In Asia as well, Japan has more than 3 times per capita than China, and more than 9 times per capita GDP of India. Sub-Saharan Africa has less than 1/10 per capita GDP of the countries of the Eurozone. Within nations, there also is, as well as in between nations, income disparities abroad, whether it is classes, races, or subdivisions of the human species. Relations of economic disparities have ranged from resignation to revolution. Because many people regard these disparities in their own country as strange, if not sinister, it is necessary to note the integral disparities are not peculiar or to any particular time or place. Therefore, the explanations of economic differences cannot be confirmed to factors in particular or to a particular time or place, such as the era of modern capitalism or the Industrial Revolution, much less to the factors that are politically convenient or emotionally satisfying. The factors raise monumental issues. I don't know how to pronounce that word. Morally monumental. I literally skipped a word. God damn it. Factors which raise morally monumentous. I don't even know how to pronounce that word. My God. Issues such as conquest and enslavement, cannot be automatically be assumed to be equally monumentous, and casually explains the current economic disparities. They may or may not be in particular cases. Peoples or nations may be rich or poor because 1. They have produced more or less than others, or 2. They have seized more what others had produced, or had what they produced seized from them. But what anyone might prefer to believe at the given place or time has nothing to do with what the hard facts are. There is no question that the Spaniards conquest in the Western Hemisphere, for example, not only brutalized and conquered peoples and destroyed valid civilizations, but they also drained vast amounts of existing wealth in gold and silver in the Western Hemisphere to Spain. 200 tons of gold, and more than 18,000 tons of silver. The result of looting existing treasures from the indigenous peoples and the forced labor of the same population in gold and silver mines. Nor Spain was unique in this behavior. The question here, however, is to what extent can transfers of wealth be economic differences between peoples and nations in the world today? Spain today is one of the poorer countries in Western Europe, surpassed economically by countries like Switzerland and Norway that have never had such empires. The vast wealth that poured into Spain in its golden age could have been invested in its economy or in its people, but it was not. It was spent. The Spaniards themselves spoke of gold pouring down Spain like rain on a roof, flooding on away immediately. Nor has it been uncommon in history the vast amounts of human suffering, whether it is conquered or enslaved people, produce nothing more than a translucent enrichment of a ruling elite. The monumental moral developments of Spain in the Western Hemisphere had very little causal effect on the long-run prosperity of the Spanish economy. As of 1900, more than half of the people in Spain were still illiterate, while blacks in the United States were literate, despite having been freed for less than 50 years. A century later, in 2000, the real capita per income in Spain was slightly lower than the real capita per income of black Americans. Descendants of greater conquerors such as the founders of the Ottoman Empire or the hordes of Genghis Khan were likewise failed to appear among the most prosperous nations of the world today. Conversely, same groups that expelled from a land of their birth and was forced to leave behind a bulk material assets had accumulated over a lifetime or over generations, simply great injustice, nevertheless rose for prosperity again after arriving a descent on their new lands. These groups range from the Jews expelled in Spain in 1492 and the Jarjas expelled from Uganda in the 1970s, while the Cubans voluntarily fled their homeland after the communists took over in 1958, and the Vietnamese who fled their homeland after the communists took over in the 1970s and had similar rebound from poverty to prosperity in new countries. Morally important issues are not necessarily decisive in causal factors. Moral questions and causal questions are both important, but confusing one or the other, or imagining that they could simply be combined into a politically or ideologically attractive package, is not a very promising approach to the explanation of economic differences. Economic disparities among nations are just part of a story of economic inequalities. Large economic disparities within nations also need to be addressed. Considering the economic differences among people in a given country, there is a tendency to see those differences as issues about what is called income distribution. But real income, that is money money income adjusted for inflation consists of goods and services produced in the nation. To look at this output solely from the viewpoint of who's receiving the money for having produced goods and services risks needless misconceptions and serious social problems growing out of misconceptions. The standard of living of a nation depends more on its output per capita than the money received as income for producing that output. Like otherwise, government could make us all rich simply by printing more money. By focusing on what you call income distribution, many people proceeded as if the government was rearranging the flows of money. So it has to have incomes be more fair, however defined. Regarding the reparations of such policy might be more fundamental process in developing goods and services in which a country's standard of living depends. But in the vision of perceived in the media and often even in academia, it is if the output of a wealth does exist somehow, but it is really interesting on the question how it's distributed. Sometimes the preoccupation of these incomes to neglect the attention of the production of output of the recipient of incomes can lead to the attempts to explain the very large incomes as greed, as if an unsustainable desire of vast amounts of money somehow causes others to pay those amounts to buy one's goods or services. Among the possible causes of differences in income and in wealth, whether among people, regions, or countries, one of the most obvious is often ignored. The economist Henry Hazlitt puts it: the real problem of poverty is not a problem of distribution, but of production. The poor are poor not because of something that is being withheld from them, but because, for whatever reason, they are not producing enough. I agree with Henry Hazlitt, actually. That's the quote by Henry Hazlitt. Oh, I'm going to lay down. My God. My neck is sore. I am having a hard time reading. My God. Okay, let me go back to Henry Hazlitt. It seems obvious that Henry Hazlitt has not. It seems obvious to Henry Hazlitt that is not obviously was not obvious to many others. There have been alternate visions with alternate agendas based on those visions. The difference between seeing economic disparities due to differences in production of wealth and seeing those disparities due to transfer of wealth from some people to other people is fundamental. History shows you can either cause history shows that either cause of economic disparities can prevail at particular times and places. While exploring the influences of geography, cultural, or other factors affecting the production of wealth, a sharp distinction must be made between the influence and determinism. Geographic determinism would be particularly favorable in natural settings more or less directly to create economic prosperity and social achievement, whether providing richer resources or having a climate more conducive for working, for example. It was not easy enough for critics to show this by the means always to the case, nor was it necessarily true in all cases, since there were poverty-stricken countries like Venezuela and Nigeria with rich natural resources, and prosperous countries like Japan and Switzerland with meager natural resources. Oh my God. I have been reading for 20 minutes. Okay, let me continue to read. I'm better at this side. Natural resources. While these kinds of climates have been highly correlated with more advanced societies in the early 20th century, geographer sought to show a very different ranking of nations by the same criteria would have existed for 1,000 or 2,000 years earlier, when China was much more advanced than Japan, while Japan eventually became more economically and technologically advanced than China thousands of years later. Without any evidence the climate had changed without any evidence the climate had changed in much of either country. The explanatory overreach of geographic explanations are not led by the dismissal of geographic determinism, but the downgrading of geography as a major influence over the senses. Yet, not all early 20th century geographers were guilty of reckless um, overreach. Distinguished geographer Elias Churchill Seppin wrote in 1911, "The whole science of anthropogeography is yet too young for hard and fast rules and is the subject matter of too complex formulas. Despite the failure of geographic determinism, geography can influence economic outcomes in other very different ways, we shall see. Moreover, this influence is not necessarily due to a particular geographic features, such as the climate or natural resources, considered in isolation, but is often due to interactions among particular geographic features in other geographic features, as well as the interactions with other non-geographic features, such as cultural, demographic, political, and other influences. Even a simple and disputed geographic fact, as places are located nearer the poles, have lower temperatures on average than places located near the equator, does not hold up when the interactions in other geographic factors have taken into account. Thus, London, with hundreds of thousands of miles further from north than Boston, has an average winter temperature warmer than those in Boston, and very similar to the winter temperatures in some American cities hundreds of miles south of Boston. The average December daily high temperature in London was the same as the average temperature December daily high temperature in Washington, D.C., which has more than 850 miles further south than London. Latitude matters, but so too does the varying warmth of the different ocean currents. The Gulf Stream, originating in subtropic waters of the Gulf of Mexico, flows northward towards the Atlantic Ocean past the British Isles, creating milder winters in Western Europe than the same latitudes in Eastern Europe, Asia, or North America. That's just talking about the outcomes. And the interactions that could create different outcomes that could either produce itself. While particular geographic factors interact with other non-geographic factors, as well as the outcomes in very different from what they could be considered geographic, cultural, or demographic or political factors in isolation, that is why the influence is not the same as determinism, since many, if not most, economic outcomes depend on more or one factor. My God, factor, not factory, my God. The likelihood of all factors coming together in such a way to produce equal levels of prosperity and progress among peoples and nations around the world seem very remote. Radically different geographic settings are this one of the factors making equal economic outputs unlikely. Cultures among the other factors that greatly differ among peoples and nations, as well as among individuals and groups within a given nation. Like critics of geographic influences, critics of cultural influences have likewise sometimes resorted to oversimplified picture of influences to criticize. For example, the attempt to discredit the influence of cultural factors in economic outcomes, such as the well-known study Why Nations Fail, have rejected the ideal of culture inherited from England, for example, on why former colonies of England, like the United States, Canada, and Australia, were prosperous. Canada and the United States were English colonies, but so were Sierra Leone and Nigeria. The variation in prosperity within former English colonies is as great as the entire world. English literacy is not the only reason for the success of North America. While it is true that these countries are former colonies of England, and thus might be descendant might be described as having been influenced by the culture of England, it is also true that the people who founded Canada and the United States were also Englishmen, descendants of people who stepped into the culture of England, and and as it unfolded over the centuries, while the people of Sierra Leone and Nigeria were descendants of people who stepped in various different cultural regions of sub-Saharan Africa for centuries, they exposed superficially to the culture of England for less than 1 century, during which their indigenous cultures were no means extinguished by the historical brief period when they were part of the British Empire. French historian Franz Bernard referred to the late anaphylactic colonization of Black Africa by European powers in the 19th century. Thus, this hardly was enough cultural turn Africans into Europeans. This was enough culturally. It was hardly enough to culturally turn Africans into Europeans. Oh my reading is so bad. I'm skipping words. I'm using a bookmark and I'm still skipping words. This is ridiculous. Oh my, I'm so frustrated. Many former English colonies populated by non-English peoples continued to observe aspects of culture of England after becoming independent. Lawyers wearing wigs in court, for example. But these outward observations of English traditions did not prevent these former colonies from having a fundamentally very different cultural legacy from that of England. Correspondingly, very different economic and political experiences going forward after independence. The attempt to discredit the influence of the culture by lumping together former colonies of Englishmen and former colonies of Africans ruled by Englishmen shows virtually any belief about almost anything that can be shown to be wrong if started in superficially simple-minded way. Believers in genetic determinism likewise seek to discredit cultural factors which can compete with their own view that it is innate genetic differences in intelligence that explain the differences between economic disparities among races, nations, and civilizations. But genetic determinism based on undeniable complementary differences per capita incomes among nations and corresponding differences among mental test scores cannot explain equally the undeniable racial changes in particular races, nations, or civilizations that have been far ahead and have been far behind in different periods of history. The Chinese and Europeans being this one example of historical reversals out of many. Nations which went from being poor and backward to reaching the front ranks of human activity in a century. Scotland, for example, at the beginning of the 20th century, and Japan at the beginning of the 19th century, had changed faster than genetic makeup seems to likely have changed, and in fact there is no indication of any genetic changes at all. Though there were many indications of cultural changes in both of these cases, researchers have been frustrated by the fact that there had been origins of particular cultures that have often lost their mints of time, though their complementary manifestations are visible. Oh my, the words are complicated, okay? This book's not easy by any means. Culture, I'm almost done. Culture also does not lead itself into quantification as genetic determinism has compiled. Therefore, we cannot produce statistical analysis such as showing a higher correlation between a nation's IQ scores and their per capita income. Such correlations may lead to an air of scientific precision, but so did the earlier contradictions between climate, prosperity, and by geographic determinism. Both sets of correlations from data taken from extremely thin slice of time compared to the many millennia of human history, which during various peoples and nations relative to achievements on changed greatly. Moreover, statisticians have often pointed out that correlation, not causation, and As it was said years ago, it is better to be roughly right than precisely wrong. Whether considering cultural, geographic, or political, uh, whether it is considered cultural, geographic, political, or other factors, interactions of these various factors are a part of the reason why understanding influences is a is very different from claiming determinism. Okay, that read was actually smaller than I thought it would be. That was chapter one. In chapter one is called Issues, and I believe, yeah, it was Issues, and it was only like 13 pages long. Yeah, it was only 13 pages long. That was nice. That was a nice little read, and so I'm gonna. I have to say that this chapter is very good at explaining things. How wealth was is not always it's not always a geographic factor. It's more, it does seem like it's interactions, and interactions can be caused by decisions in governments and trade and private property rights and things like that. And so I think what he's going to explain here is he's probably going to talk about a lot more government stuff, because politics seems to be a third of the title. Even though there's no chapter called politics, he might go into what's the next area of the book? Geographic factors, which, by the way, is not even part of the book at all. Wealth, poverty, and politics. There's no geographic on the front title. Like, I know there's some books where they have whatever, but anyway, that's besides the point. I do think that he's going to talk about more of the government structure and how, like, you want divisions of labor. Divisions of labor, but you also want divisions of power. And divisions of power are private versus public, and you don't want everything to be public, or else you're not going to get the innovation from the private sector. Maybe, I'm not 100% certain what he's talking about. Although there is some innovations, like NASA, for instance, was a very innovative company because they were military technology. Military technology has always been proved, public-wise, it's always been proved. Although it is a private contract in a government form. So in that sense, it's weird. The military is like a, kind of like, it's like a business thing, but it's got the privacy of a business, but it's funded by the public. So it's like a monopoly, but it innovates. Military technology innovates because they always want to make sure that they're protecting the supply chain, the trades, the transactions, just like what Thomas Sowell's talking about. So in that regard, I know I'm kind of going off my own tangent why I'm thinking about wealth a very different way. And he is talking about, like, he doesn't seem like he likes the fact that people think that certain ethnicities are better at certain things than other ethnicities. He seems to not like that, and I understand. And he talks about how literacy in the United States is higher than in Spain. Half the people in Spain were not literate, but yet the black Americans were literate. I don't know why he's going off a race, but whatever, he is. So that's what he's taking it out as, because a lot of people seem to think that race has something to do with wealth. I don't know if I necessarily believe that race does. I think it all depends on your decisions. I think Thomas Sowell is incredibly wealthy because, again, he wrote a book, and he's black. He's not, I think he's black, I don't know, but, like, whatever he classifies himself as, he is, he's successful because of his decisions. Not because of anything, not because of his people group, you know what I mean? And so I hate when people, I know this is weird to say, I hate when people, they value their group more than they value themselves. They value their religion, or they value their ideals more than they value their actions. And that is something, they value what they were born as, or what they believe, more than what they're doing. And I always find it so frustrating, because that's not how you build a conductive line of reasoning. You have to do things to improve your life. You cannot like, you can think, oh, this God might give me something, but how about you just do something to make that better? How about you do something to make sure that happens? You know what I mean? Like, I don't think some mysterious force is gonna give you something, but I could be entirely wrong. I don't know what the laws of the universe are. Right, I don't know the quantum realm or anything like that. I don't know the little particles that go, this is a negative particle, this is a positive particle across the universe. Quantum particles. I don't know any of that. So again, like, everything's predetermined in some way. I believe that we don't have free will, but we do have freedom. You know what I mean? So it's weird because I have the negative English negative English like thought where yeah we need to separate division of powers, but we also make we don't have free will, and so like that's the thing is I have that's the distinction between me and many other peoples. I believe we don't have free will, but we should have freedom, despite the fact we don't have free will. I believe in freedom. I don't believe in free will, and that's the thing that people don't seem to understand is your decisions are a bunch of chemicals in your brain. They're not actually free will. The fact that people say they are, and the fact that people claim they are, and some people want you to do something that you don't want to do, it's all predetermined. It's all your environment makes it so you can. I don't know. I mean, I had a hard time reading this chapter. This is going to be a train wreck if this is the way I'm reading. I'm literally using a bookmark and I'm putting syllables at the ends of words. I am putting syllables at the ends of words that aren't even there. They're not even there. I'm terrible at English. This is why Thomas Sowell is so hard to read. I love reading John Bogle because when you read John Bogle, the words are simple. They're not complicated. When you read Thomas Sowell, however, I like the way he explains things. I do. I generally do like some of the ways he explains things, but his words he uses in pretty much every sentence. It's like it doesn't flow. It's very academic. It's very I don't know how to explain it, but it's like John Bogle. You can see that he's trying to write to the common parliaments. Thomas Sowell. It does seem like he wants to write to the common parliaments, but he's having a very hard time writing. And maybe I might get Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson because at this point I have been struggling to read Thomas Sowell books for a while now, and I love Thomas Sowell. I love his ideals. His ideals have revolutionized a lot of people's thinking, but I mean he's not the first one to come up with most of these ideals, but he really should get a Nobel Peace Prize for some of them because Knowledge and Decisions is one of his best works. I've heard nothing but great things about Knowledge and Decisions, although I have never read it personally. I heard it was talking about the knowledge problem, how a government can never do a marginal utility on the economy. They can never do it. They'll never get the supply correctly, and the fact that they have targets that either limit or accelerate something, they'll never get what a consumer demands for. They'll never do it. There's always going to be inefficiencies, and there's going to be a ton of paperwork because now everything's for free, but now we got to have a slowdown because, you can't get everything for free. There's no such thing as a freelance. Somebody has to take something to get that freelance. I mean, or they have to do some labor or they have to trade in order to get that freelance. I'd rather that freelance come from trade, or that lunch come from trade than forcefullism. That from government intervention. So that's my perspective. I think that Milton Friedman's, I know I'm going off these random authors, but F.A. Hayek, Thomas Sowell, and Milton Friedman are like the three best economists. Thomas Sowell and Milton Friedman are, what are they, scholars of monetarism, and then F.A. Hayek's more of the scholar of the constitutional liberty, in his own ideology, and then John Bogle's talking about, owner's capitalism, and how owner's capitalism, is different from manager's capitalism, how managers have taken over the owners, and, I like those economists. Those are my four favorite economists. I should be listening to Henry Hazlitt. After reading that quote from Henry Hazlitt, I should be reading Henry Hazlitt. I don't know why I haven't read him. But I have read articles from Henry Hazlitt. He hasn't been live for 20 or 30 years at this point. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed this read despite my struggle today, despite everything. I've struggled today to read. It took me forever. It took me 36 minutes or whatever, and I just couldn't get past half of those words. Or most of those words. Every sentence I stumbled on a word. It was ridiculous. This is why I struggle with English. It's not necessarily that I disagree with them. It's just that they write so complicated. If there was somebody who could write better, somebody who can make sense of it better than Thomas Sowell. Thomas Sowell is a good writer. Don't get me wrong. He's better than Milton Friedman, I would say. But the problem is he still writes complicatedly. I wish he was more like John Bogle. John Bogle will always be my favorite just because the way he writes is so simple And he writes the same thing over and over again, so you don't really have to think that hard. I mean, his economic lesson's always the same generally about passive investing. But you know, you are someone, I'm someone else. I'm sorry about this review. This is gonna go downhill from here. I can already tell. You are someone, and I'm someone else, and I just read the first chapter of Wealth, Poverty, and Politics Issues is the name of the chapter. Goodbye.